She didn't know his name. She didn't know his bloodline, his pack, or the price that had been placed on his life before he was old enough to walk. She didn't know that 3 packs were looking for him, that a dead man had carried him across 4 territories in a single night, or that the blood soaking through the stranger's shirt on her doorstep was the last thing standing between a child and something she didn't yet have the language for. She knew one thing: he was small, and he was warm, and he was sleeping against a dying man's chest like the world was still safe. Kala Voss opened her door on the worst night of winter and made the decision that would rearrange the rest of her life. Not because she was brave, not because she understood what she was taking on, but because a child looked up at her with amber eyes and patted her cheek. And she was not the kind of woman who could put that down. She should have put it down. She didn't. And 3 years later, when the alpha of the Duskfall pack stood at her gate with his jaw tight and his eyes on the boy playing in her garden, she understood, finally, completely, that some decisions don't ask your permission before they change everything you are. This is the story of what she chose, and what chose her back. She almost didn't open the door. That was the part Kala Voss would think about for years afterward. The ordinary hesitation of a woman alone on a winter night, the wind coming hard off the border hills, the fire low in the grate and her boots already off. She had been 3 pages from the end of a medical text she'd read 4 times already, and she had almost decided that whatever was making that sound outside could wait until morning. She opened the door. She knew it immediately, the way healers know, not from any single thing, but from the sum of everything at once. The color of his skin, the angle of his breath, the way his body was already beginning to organize itself around the business of shutting down, conserving what little it had left for the things that still needed doing. He was wolf-born. She could see that too. The structure of him was wrong for a human man. Too broad, too dense. The bones underneath built for something more than this ordinary body was showing. His shirt was black with blood on the left side, soaked through and still spreading. And his eyes, when they found her face, were the amber gold that wolf-born eyes sometimes went under extreme duress. He was holding a child. Kala's mind went very still and very clear, the way it did in emergencies. She took in the child in a single sweep. Small, perhaps 1 year old, bundled in a wolf fur wrap that was warmer than anything else the man was wearing. Dark hair curling at the temples. A round, peaceful face with lashes fanned out against soft cheeks, sleeping with the absolute, guileless trust of an infant who had not yet learned that the world could be unsafe. One tiny fist was curled against the dying man's chest, gripping his shirt. The man looked at her. He looked at the child. He looked back at her and she saw it. The entire weight of the ask. The enormous and terrible thing he needed from a woman he had never met. The desperation of a person who had run out of every other option and had ended up, by necessity or fate or some combination of the two, on a stranger's doorstep with nothing left to offer but a dying man's pleas. He held out a folded piece of paper. His hand was shaking. She took it. He sat down on her threshold, slowly, carefully, deliberately, a man choosing where he would fall, and then he did not get back up. She moved him inside first, because she was a healer, and she could not leave him in the cold no matter what he was, or what came next. She laid him on the floor of her front room, near the fire, and she worked on him for 2 hours with everything she had. She was very good. She had been doing this since she was 17 years old, and she had pulled people back from worse. He died at the hour before dawn, quietly, without waking. She had held his hand because it seemed like the least she could do, and because the child had woken once during those 2 hours and looked at the man on the floor with an expression of solemn and complete understanding that had made Kala's chest hurt in a way she had not been prepared for. When it was over, she sat on her heels beside him and breathed. The child was in her lap. She had picked him up when he'd started to fuss, and he had settled immediately, tucked under her chin with the automatic competence of an infant who knew exactly where warmth came from. He smelled like wood smoke and wolf fur and something sweeter underneath that she would later learn was simply what he smelled like, the particular and unrepeatable scent of this specific person. She unfolded the note. It had been written in a hurry, the handwriting deteriorating from controlled to desperate, across 4 short lines. Keep him safe. Tell no one his name. He is not yet what he will become. Neither are you. I am sorry to do this to a stranger. The child breathed against her neck, steady and warm and entirely trusting. Calla Voss had no pack. She had left pack territory 6 years ago, and built something quiet and self-sufficient in this border town. A life that asked nothing of the wolf world and expected nothing in return. She owed this child nothing. She owed the man on her floor nothing. She owed the wolf world, which had taken things from her she had never asked to give, absolutely nothing. She looked at the note. She looked at the child. He opened his eyes, and they found her face with the immediate and uncomplicated certainty of a child who had decided, in the span of a single look, that she was safe. He reached up and patted her cheek. Calla thought, well. She thought, well then. She held him tighter and made the decision that would rearrange every remaining year of her life. She buried the wolf at first light, at the edge of the eastern tree line where the old birches grew close together, and the ground stayed soft enough to work even in winter. She did not mark the grave. She had learned early, from the wolf world, from the years before she'd left it, that unmarked things were harder to find. She told her neighbor Petra, a stout and observant woman of 70 who had seen enough of the world to ask very few unnecessary questions, that her younger cousin had died suddenly in the south, and left the child with no other family. Petra looked at Calla with the particular sharpness of a woman who had survived 70 years by paying attention, and then she looked at the child, who was sitting on Calla's kitchen table, eating a piece of dried apple with enormous concentration. Petra said, "What's his name?" Calla had not planned for this. The note said, "Tell no one his name," which meant she could not use whatever name he had been born with, which meant she needed to give him one. She thought of the first kind person she had ever known, an old healer in a village near the eastern range who had taught her everything she knew about roots and tinctures and the particular architecture of the human body, who had never once asked her to be anything other than what she was, who had died in the winter of her 19th year and left her his books and his tools and the stubborn belief that a person could do a great deal of good in the world if they paid attention. "Emmerich," she said. The child looked up from his dried apple. He looked at her with those amber eyes, steady and considering. "Emmerich," she said again, softer, testing it. He went back to his apple. "Emmerich," Petra said, tasting the word. "Strong name." She held out her arms. The child considered her for a moment, with the solemnity of someone assessing a situation thoroughly, then held out his arms in return. Petra took him. He settled against her shoulder. Petra looked at Calla over the top of his dark hair with an expression that said, "I have questions, and also I will not ask them right now." "I'll watch him this morning," Petra said. "Go get some sleep. You look terrible." Calla went to bed for 4 hours, and lay awake for 3 of them, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the note folded in her apron pocket, and the man buried at the tree line, and the particular weight of an infant falling asleep in her arms like it was the most natural thing in the world. She got up. She had patience to see. She had a child to raise. Emmerich at 1 year old was already alarming. This was Calla's private assessment, recorded in the margins of her healer's journal in the small, precise handwriting she used for observations she wasn't sure what to do with yet. She had created a page titled simply, "Things About Emmerich," underlined twice, and she added to it regularly. He identified medicinal herbs by smell 6 months before he could walk. Not all of them. He was 1 year old. There were limits, but yarrow he called ow-ah and pointed at injuries. Lavender made him drowsy, and he called it seep with an expression of mild betrayal. Calendula was you-wow fix. Willow bark was bitter, delivered with the specific moral indignation of a child who felt the world had misled him. She began testing him the way she tested everything, methodically, with patience, without leading. She would set a bundle of dried herbs on the table and watch where his hands went. She kept records. She cross-referenced. She was a healer, and she did not believe in magic, only in things she had not yet found the proper explanation for. She did not yet have an explanation for Emmerich. At 14 months he began indicating things she could not hear or see. He would go to the window and stare down the road a full minute before wagons appeared. He heard her neighbor's hound whining in distress through 3 walls and communicated this by grabbing Kalla's wrist and pulling until she followed him. Once, in the incident she thought of simply as the pot. He crossed the entire garden at a determined toddle to find her, seized her hand, and pulled with an urgency entirely disproportionate to his 8 teeth. And she followed him inside to find her soup boiling over. She wrote in the margin, "Hearing range, extraordinary. Cross-ref wolf-born sensory development. See Alden March texts, Chapter 9. She read Chapter 9. She read it 3 times. She sat with the implications of it for a while. She had always known, technically, that she was raising a wolf child. The man who had brought him to her door had been wolf-born. The fur wrap, the amber eyes. These were not subtle signals. But knowing and understanding are different things. And understanding what Emmerich was going to become, the full scope of it, the senses and the strength and the shift, made her sit very quietly at her kitchen table for an evening, and breathe carefully, and think about what she was doing, and what it would require of her. She was not afraid of it. That surprised her a little. She had expected to be afraid. What she felt instead was a kind of fierce protectiveness. Not of herself, of him. She was going to make sure he was ready for it. She was going to make sure he was never afraid of himself. She had been afraid of herself once. She knew what it cost. At 2 years old, Emmerich had the emotional composure of someone significantly older, which was both impressive and occasionally unnerving. He processed the ordinary difficulties of toddlerhood, frustration, tiredness, the injustice of bedtimes, with a stillness that most adults took years to develop. He rarely had tantrums. When things were hard, he went quiet, turned inward, sat with it in the way of a creature that knew how to endure. He laughed, though. That was the counterweight. He laughed with his entire body, a sound so full and sudden that it startled people the first time they heard it, and they always smiled afterward, whether they wanted to or not. He laughed at beetles. He laughed at market day. He laughed at Petra's cat, who regarded him with aristocratic suspicion and occasionally permitted him to stroke one ear. He asked questions constantly. Not the random, associative questions of an ordinary toddler, but the focused, sequential questions of a mind working its way toward a specific answer. Why does the yarrow stop bleeding? And on, patient and interested, following the thread wherever it led. Kalla answered everything. She had decided early that she would never tell him something was too complicated, or that he was too young. If she didn't know the answer, she said so, and they looked it up together. And she watched him absorb information the way dry ground absorbed rain. Completely, immediately, without waste. He was going to be extraordinary. She could see it already, the shape of who he was going to be, and it filled her with something she didn't have a word for. Pride, but not quite. Love, but bigger than that. The particular, terrifying joy of being trusted with something irreplaceable. He shifted for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon in his 27th month. Kalla was at the kitchen table writing patient notes, and he was on the floor beside her, arranging small stones into patterns that he would then rearrange according to some system she hadn't been able to decode, and then she heard a sound she had only heard once before. Years ago in packed territory, a sound like the air itself rearranging around a body that was changing its fundamental shape. She looked up. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. A ripple across his small form, a flicker in the amber of his eyes, a sense of something vast briefly visible beneath the surface of a child. Then it was over, and he was simply a toddler on her kitchen floor, looking mildly surprised at himself. He looked up at her. She set down her pen. She slid off her chair and sat on the floor beside him, cross-legged. At his level, her heart was doing something complicated in her chest, but she kept her face easy, open, the face she used in sick rooms when she needed patients not to be frightened. "That's your wolf," she said. "You felt it?" He nodded carefully. He was watching her face the way he always watched faces, reading it, checking for information. "It's part of you," she said. "It's supposed to be there. It's not going to hurt you." She paused. "Are you scared?" He considered the question with characteristic seriousness. Then he shook his head. "Good," she said. "You don't have to be. It's yours. Okay?" He looked at her for another moment. Then he patted her hand, reassuringly, deliberately, the gesture of a child who had decided that she was the one who needed comforting, and turned back to his stones. Calla sat on the kitchen floor, and breathed through her nose and thought, "I am going to be in so much trouble over this child." She already was. She just hadn't named it yet. At 3 years old, Emmerich Voss. He had taken her name. Or rather, she had given it to him. At around the 18-month mark, when official records had needed to be kept, and she had needed to write something on the line that said family, was the single most beloved person in Ashfen. He had arrived at this position entirely without strategy. He simply paid attention to people and remembered what they told him, and in a world where most people felt invisible most of the time, this was an extraordinary and almost unfair gift. He remembered that the baker's hands hurt in cold weather, so he asked about them specifically on cold days. He remembered that the blacksmith's eldest son had gone south 2 years ago, and that this made the blacksmith sad in a way he didn't talk about. So Emmerich asked about the son sometimes, careful and interested, giving the blacksmith permission to talk about him. He remembered that old Petra liked it when her beetles were identified correctly and incorrectly, because it gave her an opportunity to correct him, which she enjoyed, so he occasionally got them wrong on purpose. Calla caught him doing this one morning and stared at him. "That's not a rove beetle," Petra was saying with great satisfaction, pointing at the creature on Emmerich's palm. "That's a ground beetle. See the shape of the thorax." "Oh," Emmerich said, with the expression of someone learning this for the first time. Later, in the kitchen, Calla said, "You know the difference between a rove beetle and a ground beetle." Emmerich looked up from his lunch. "She likes explaining things," he said. Calla looked at her 3-year-old son for a long moment. "Yes," she said finally. "She does." He went back to his lunch. Calla wrote in the margins of her journal that evening, "Emotional intelligence, exceptional. Manipulation potential, concerning. Love him completely." Underlined twice. He called her Mama for the first time on a cold morning in his 31st month. She was at the sink with her back to him, and she almost missed it. He said it quietly, matter-of-factly. The way he said everything that he had decided was simply true. "Mama, look." She turned. He was pointing at a spider in the corner of the windowsill, very large and very still, regarding them both with whatever spiders regard things with. "That's a spider," she said. Her voice came out completely normal. She was proud of herself. "I know," he said. "It's been there 3 days. Should we move it?" They discussed the spider for several minutes. They decided together to leave it, because spiders ate things that were worse than spiders. And Emmerich watched it with satisfaction, while Calla finished the dishes and thought about the word he had said, and the absolutely ordinary way he had said it. Like it was a thing that had always been true, that he was simply now stating out loud. That evening, when he was in bed and the house was quiet, she sat at her kitchen table and let herself feel the full size of what she had done. In 3 years, without planning to build it. This life, this small and specific and irreplaceable life. She pressed her hand flat on the table and breathed. She was not sorry. That was the thing she had needed to check. And checking it was clear and immediate. She was not sorry. She would do it again. She would open the door again, pick him up again, bring him inside again, bury the man at the tree line, and lie to Petra, and write the name on the official form, and every single day of the 3 years that had followed. She would do it all again. She went to bed. She slept well for the first time in recent memory. He came on a Tuesday in early spring, when the snowmelt had turned the road into ashfen, the color of old brick, and the first tentative green was pushing through last year's dead growth in the hedgerows. Calla was in the front garden. She was deadheading the dried stalks of last autumn's yarrow, which was not urgent work but was satisfying in the particular way of tasks that made immediate visible progress. And Emmerich was on the step behind her arranging pebbles into a pattern she suspected was a map of the market district. She heard the horse before she saw it. And then, half a second later, she noticed that Emmerich had gone completely still behind her. She knew the sound of Emmerich going still. She had learned it across 3 years, the way she had learned all his sounds, what his silences meant, which ones were concentration and which were assessment and which, rare and important, were the particular quality of stillness that meant he was processing something significant. This was the last kind. She turned slowly. She did not reach for her shears. She simply turned and looked, the way she looked at patients when she needed information. Open, neutral, taking in everything at once. The man at her gate was tall, not just in the measurement of it but in the way certain people were tall, as if height were a secondary quality, and the primary one was presence, gravity, the specific density of a person who occupied their space completely and without apology. He was dark in coloring, dark-eyed, with the kind of face that had probably been purely handsome before something long and difficult had lived inside it for a significant number of years. He was dressed for travel. He had money, but wasn't performing it. He was wolf-born. She could see it in the structure of him, the same way she had seen it in the man who had died on her floor 3 years ago. He was looking at Emmerich with an expression that was doing everything in its power to stay controlled and not quite succeeding. Something in his face, when he looked at the child, was not controlled at all. Kala set down her shears. She stood up slowly. She moved, without hurry and without drama, until she was positioned between the gate and the step where Emmerich was sitting. "Can I help you?" she said. It was not a question. The man's eyes moved from Emmerich to her. They were very dark and very steady, and they were doing the same thing his face had been doing. Holding something enormous at arm's length with professional force, not entirely winning. "My name is Kale Acheron," he said. His voice was low and even and controlled. "I've been looking for someone." Kala said nothing. She waited. He looked past her at Emmerich. Something in his jaw tightened. "I believe," he said, carefully, "that I may have found him." She made him wait at the gate. She went inside, took Emmerich to Petra's house 2 doors down. Petra received them with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had decided long ago to be useful rather than interrogative. And then she came back and stood at her own gate and looked at the alpha of the Duskfall pack, who had not moved. He was the kind of man who waited well. She noted this the way she noted everything. Filed it, held it, gave it its proper weight. "Come in," she said. "We'll talk inside." He came in. He was careful with the gate, she noticed. Closed it properly, the latch all the way down. A small thing. She noted it anyway. She made tea because her hands needed occupation and because hospitality, even extended to a wolf alpha who had arrived uninvited at her gate, was the armor she knew best. She moved around her kitchen with the efficiency of a woman who knew exactly where everything was and used the time to watch him from her peripheral vision. He looked at her herbs. He looked at the rows of tinctures, organized by use and potency. He looked at her healer's journal, open on the counter, at the dense handwriting filling every margin. His expression did something careful and unreadable. She set the tea in front of him and sat across the table. "Tell me who you are," she said. "All of it. Before you say anything about the child." He looked at her. It was a long look, the kind of look that was doing significant work, measuring and assessing and, she thought, deciding. Not whether to trust her, how much. He landed on, all of it. "I am the alpha of the Duskfall pack," he said. "The child is my son. His name, his given name, is Calder Acheron. 3 years ago there was an attempt on my bloodline. His mother died before he was born. The attempt continued after his birth. My most trusted guard, a man named Farron, took my son and ran the night of the second attempt. He had instructions to hide the child somewhere safe, somewhere no one would think to look, and send word when it was done." He stopped. His hands, wrapped around the cup she had given him, tightened slightly. Word never came. Farron never came back. "I have been looking for 3 years. Kala sat with this for a moment. She heard everything in it. The dead ends, the wrong trails, the 3 years of not knowing whether his son was alive. She heard what it had cost him to keep looking, what it would have cost him to stop. She thought of the note. I am sorry to do this to a stranger, she said. Farron is buried at the eastern tree line. The birches. I'll show you. When we're done here. Something in his face changed. Not relief. Not exactly. The acknowledgement of a grief that had been waiting 3 years for a place to land. Thank you, he said, very quietly. I'm not finished, she said. Before you see him, before we discuss anything about what comes next, I need you to understand something first. He looked at her and waited. She kept her voice even and her eyes direct. He is 3 years old. He does not know the name Calder. He does not know anything about Duskfall or the Pack, or what he is going to inherit. He has been Emmerich for 3 years, and that name belongs to him. I gave it to him because the note said not to use his real name, and he has grown into it completely. And I will not have him frightened or destabilized by a stranger walking through my gate and telling him everything he knows about himself is wrong. She paused. He is a child first. Whatever else he is, heir, alpha bloodline, future pack leader, he is 3 years old first. If you cannot hold that in mind, then we are done talking. The alpha of the Duskfall pack looked at her across her kitchen table for a long, silent moment. She did not look away. Yes, he said. I understand. All of it. Something in her, a tension she had been holding in her shoulders since she'd heard the horse on the road, eased slightly. Not gone, just less. The threat, she said. Is it over? He looked at the table. Mostly. Most of the faction has been dealt with. 2 members remain unaccounted for, until I have confirmation that they are no longer a threat. You can't take him back to Duskfall, she said. No. So you need to stay here. If you'll allow it. I would not impose. It's not an imposition, she said. It's your son. She was quiet for a moment. It is, however, my home, and he has been my responsibility for 3 years. That does not disappear because you have arrived. I know, he said. He was looking at her steadily. I'm not asking it to. She studied him, the careful honesty of him. 3 years of looking and not finding and not stopping. There's a room upstairs, she said finally. It's small. That's fine. I have standards for how he is treated. Of course. I'm being serious. So am I, he said. His eyes held hers. I am not here to disrupt what you have built for him. I am here because he is my son, and I have been afraid for 3 years, and now I would like, if you will permit it, to simply be near him while I make sure he is safe. She looked at him for another moment. Something in her chest did something she chose not to examine yet. One rule first, she said. Tonight, when you meet him, you are simply a visitor. A man who knew the person who brought him to me as a baby. Nothing more. He doesn't get the rest of it yet. Not the pack, not the bloodline, not the name. When he's ready, we discuss it together. Both of us. Cale nodded. Agreed. Good, she said. I'll go get him. She explained it to Emmerich carefully, at his level, with the precision she used for things that mattered. A man had come to visit. He had known the person who had brought Emmerich to Calla when Emmerich was very small. He had been looking for Emmerich for a while because he wanted to make sure Emmerich was safe and well. He was glad to know that Emmerich was both of those things. Emmerich had listened with his chin slightly lifted and his amber eyes serious. Then he had said, "Is he sad?" Calla had paused. "I think," she said carefully, "that he has been worried for a long time, and that seeing you will make him less worried. But yes, I think there is some sadness in it." Emmerich had processed this. "Okay," he said. "I'll be careful with him." She had not expected that. She had stopped expecting to be surprised by him. But he surprised her constantly anyway. They found Cale in the front garden, standing with his back to the door. He turned at the sound of it opening. Emmerich looked at him. Calla, watching both of them, saw it happen. Saw the moment Cale's face did the thing it had been fighting not to do since he'd arrived at the gate. A fracture, brief and controlled, gone almost immediately. His son. 3 years and he was looking at his son. She looked at Emmerich and saw, with the clarity of someone who had spent 3 years learning every expression on that particular face, that Emmerich was looking at Cale the same way he looked at everything important, with complete and unhurried attention, taking inventory. "You smell like the forest," Emmerich said. Not accusatory. Curious. The assessment of a child who led with senses. Cale crouched down, bringing himself to eye level, careful and slow. I spend a lot of time in it, he said. I like the forest, Emmerich said. Calla shows me plants. He glanced back at her, the quick checking glance she knew well, the one that said you're here and I know it, and I'm going to keep going. And then back at Cale. Do you know about plants? Not as much as I should, Cale said. Emmerich considered this. I can teach you some, he said generously. The useful ones. Something moved in Cale's throat. He swallowed. He looked at Cale for another moment with those amber eyes. The same color, Calla realized with a start she should have been expecting, as Cale's own, and then said, Are you staying for dinner? If that's all right, Cale said. He looked at Calla. She looked at the two of them, the man crouching in her garden, his face carefully assembled around something enormous, and the child in front of him who had already decided, with 3-year-old efficiency, that this person was acceptable and could stay. Yes, she said. Stay for dinner. Cale Acheron had been alpha for 11 years. He had negotiated treaties with 3 hostile packs. He had gone to war once. A short and brutal conflict that had ended in his favor largely because he had been willing to be more thorough than his opponent. He had managed a succession crisis, 2 famines, a flood that had taken out the lower third of his western territory, and a council faction that had tried to have his heir killed before his heir was old enough to have opinions about it. He had not been prepared for dinner, specifically for the dinner where his 3-year-old son asked him 11 sequential questions about horses, explained the difference between edible and non-edible mushrooms with the pedagogical enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for a new student, and then, discovering that Cale had mispronounced yarrow, corrected him with a patience that was somehow more mortifying than impatience would have been. Yarrow, Emmerich said, for the second time, slowly. Yarrow, Cale said. Better, Emmerich said, encouragingly. He patted Cale's arm. Across the table, the healer was doing something with her face that was not quite a smile, but was in the territory adjacent to one. She was cutting Emmerich's food into pieces with one hand, and following the conversation with both eyes. And she was, Cale was increasingly understanding, paying very close attention to everything. He had catalogued her initially, on the way to Ashfen, as a variable, a complication, someone who had stepped into a gap that had opened in his life, and who would, with appropriate compensation and reassurance, step back out of it. He had prepared, in the professional way he prepared for difficult conversations, a number of reasonable arguments for why taking Calder back to Duskfall was the best outcome for everyone. He had been in her house for 6 hours. He was already understanding that his prepared arguments were insufficient. It was not that she was difficult. It was that she was real, in a way that made the word variable seem almost insulting in retrospect. She was a person who had built something from nothing, in 3 years, from a dying man's last request. The evidence was everywhere, in the organized precision of her shelves, in the way Emmerich ate without being asked, and said thank you without being prompted, and reached for her hand under the table when he was tired, a gesture so automatic she probably didn't notice she was receiving it anymore. A family. He kept arriving at this word, and being stopped by it. He had walked into a family. A small, complete, fiercely self-sufficient family that had formed without him, while he was spending 3 years looking for it. After dinner, after Emmerich had been put to bed in a process that involved 3 stories and a serious negotiation about blanket arrangement, she came back downstairs and sat across from him and said, "Tell me about the faction, everything you know." He told her he had not told anyone outside Duskfall, not because he didn't trust people, but because information was leverage, and he had learned early that controlling what you shared was the first layer of protection. He told her anyway. He wasn't entirely sure why. Something about the way she listened, complete and unhurried, her hands folded on the table, her eyes on his face, made the usual calculations feel small. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "The 2 unaccounted members. Do you know anything about their patterns?" "Some. Enough to know that when they move, they'll come for him directly." They won't announce themselves. She nodded. She was looking at the table with the expression she got. He was already learning. When she was thinking something through to its end. So, until they're found, you stay. If you'll allow it. She looked up. I told you. It's not about permission. Then I'll stay, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the room is small. Truly. I'm not understating it. I've slept in worse. I'll need to know your schedule. If you're going to be in the house, it has to work with his routine, not against it. Of course. And he asks questions. A lot of questions. If you don't know the answer, you say so, and you don't make something up. Because he will eventually find out, and it will bother him. She paused. He has a very precise relationship with the truth. I noticed, Cale said. Something in her expression shifted. Not softer exactly, but less guarded. A small, involuntary thing. Then, the wind, the faint sound of his son breathing 2 floors up. He had not been able to hear that for 3 years. He had not known, until right now, how much of him had been listening for it the whole time. He pressed his knuckles against his mouth, and breathed. He was going to have to be very careful here. He was going to have to move slowly and deliberately and earn every inch. He knew how to do this. He had built an entire territory this way, patient and thorough. He could do it for this. He was going to have to do it for this. The first week taught him what Tuesdays looked like. Tuesdays in Ashfen looked like this. Emmerich woke at dawn without fail, and arrived in the kitchen in the order of a small force of nature, all of his hair going in different directions, and all of his attention immediately and fully awake. He required, in sequence, water in the specific blue cup on the second shelf from the left. Not the other blue cup, the one that was more blue. Information about the day's plan. And something to eat. Calla produced the blue cup and the information without looking up from whatever she was already writing at the table, because she had been awake for an hour already. Emmerich ate standing up by the window, monitoring the street with the vigilance of a small and extremely invested security detail. On the third Tuesday, Cale had the water and the cup waiting when Emmerich came downstairs. Emmerich stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the cup on the table, and then at Cale, with an expression of careful reassessment. It's the right one, he said, checking. The more blue one, Cale confirmed. Emmerich climbed into his chair, pulled the cup toward him, and said, Today we are going to the blacksmith. He is making a door hinge. Is that the plan? Calla said from her notes, without looking up. It is my plan, Emmerich said. We'll see about that. They went to the blacksmith. Oswin, who regarded Emmerich as a small and unusually technically minded colleague, regarded Cale with the flat wariness of a man who had heard the word alpha before and had views. Cale asked intelligent questions about the hinge and did not once invoke authority of any kind. And by the end of the visit, Oswin was explaining the metallurgical properties of different iron grades to both of them, while Emmerich sat on an overturned bucket with his chin in his hands, entirely satisfied. Cale had been alpha for 11 years. He had sat through more council meetings than he could count, more negotiations, more formal dinners, where the food was fine and nothing of substance was discussed. He could not remember the last time he had paid such close attention to anything as he paid to the metallurgical properties of iron, on a Tuesday morning in a border town blacksmith shop. Listened. The town absorbed him the same way it had absorbed Emmerich, through accumulation, through the ordinary repetition of days. Petra, when introduced, looked him up and down with the precision of a woman who had been assessing people for 7 decades and needed very little time to land on her conclusions. You have his eyes, she said. She went inside and came back with a jar of preserved plums. His favorite, she said. You should know these things. He stood on Calla's front step holding the jar of plums and felt something in his chest come loose that had been locked in place for 3 years. Not all at once, just one small locked thing. Yielding. The baker gave him yesterday's bread because Emmerich had told her that the tall man visiting was learning about plants, and the baker had decided, on this basis, that he was acceptable. Probably fine. The children who played in the road near Calla's house learned that he would give accurate answers to questions about horses and the forest, and gradually began to treat him as an information resource, which he found entirely reasonable. He was being absorbed. He was aware of it happening, and he let it happen, because the alternative was to remain separate. And separate from this was something he found he did not want to be. With Kala, it was slower, more careful on both sides. Without negotiating it explicitly, at a kind of working arrangement. He cooked in the evenings, because she was often with patients late, and he had learned that cooking was something his hands did well, without requiring much of his mind. She did not thank him for this, beyond eating what was in front of her, and asking what was in it, which was somehow more honest than thanks would have been. She let him come on house calls when Emmerich was with Petra, ostensibly so he could learn the lay of the territory. He was learning the lay of the territory. He was also learning her. The healer's calm she kept in sick rooms. The way she translated complicated information into plain language, without ever making patients feel reduced by the simplification, the particular quality of attention she gave to people who were frightened. The way that attention was the same one she gave Emmerich, he realized. Complete and steady and entirely without conditions. He watched her work and thought things he set aside carefully. The bond had been there from the moment he'd come through her gate. He had felt it the way he'd been told it felt, as recognition, as a click of something into place that had been missing so long he'd forgotten about the gap. He recognized it because he had heard other bonded wolves describe it, and because it was unmistakable in the way certain things were found. Not complicated, not ambiguous, simply true. He had not been looking for this. He had been looking for his son. He had found his son, and then he had found this. This woman in her border town kitchen, with her healer's hands, and her direct eyes, and her 3 years of doing something extraordinary, and calling it ordinary. He said nothing about it. She was not a person you assumed things about, and he had not earned the right to assume anything yet. He moved carefully, as he always moved in situations that mattered, and he paid attention, and he waited. Kala knew about mate bonds. She had grown up near enough to pack territory to have observed them. The specific gravity between two bonded wolves, the way they oriented to each other in a room without meaning to, the quality of attention that looked ordinary from a distance and was nothing of the kind up close. She had watched bonded pairs her whole life with the clinical interest of a healer cataloging something she expected never to encounter personally. She was half wolf. Enough for the senses, the long life, the faster healing. She had assumed it was not enough for a bond. She had been wrong. It had happened on his 4th evening in her house. She had come downstairs after putting Emmerich to bed to find Kale at the sink, washing the dinner dishes with his back to her, unaware she was there. The lamplight was warm. The kitchen smelled like the soup he had made, something with herbs from her garden that had been better than she'd expected. He was rolling up his sleeves with the focused quiet of a man who did not know he was being watched, and she stood in the doorway for 10 seconds before he heard her and turned. And in those 10 seconds, something in the center of her chest simply opened. Not gradually, not as a question, as an answer to something she hadn't known she was asking. She had thought, oh no. She had thought of all the timing, of all the circumstances, of absolutely all the people. She had thought, he is going to take Emmerich back to Duskfall, and I am going to be left here with a bond and an empty chair, and the specific relentless grief of loving something I couldn't keep. Then she had walked into the kitchen and asked if there was anything left from dinner, and they had talked for 20 minutes about nothing in the particular. And she had said good night and gone to bed, and lain in the dark with her hand flat on her chest, as if she could hold the feeling in place, while she figured out what to do with it. She had managed it. She was good at managing things. What was harder to manage was watching him with Emmerich. She had expected it to be difficult. A man arriving to disrupt the life she had built, the child she had raised, the equilibrium of 3 years. She had prepared for resistance, for the instinctive protectiveness of someone who had done all the work and was now expected to share the result. What she had not prepared for was the specific quality of Kale with his son. He was careful. That was the first thing. He did not press, did not assert, did not use the authority he clearly carried everywhere as a default. He followed Emmerich's lead with a patience that surprised her. a man who was accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room, sitting cross-legged on a kitchen floor, because Emmerich wanted to show him the optimal arrangement of his stone collection. He listened, really listened, in the way that Kalle valued above almost everything else. He remembered what Emmerich told him and referenced it later. He asked follow-up questions. Emmerich, who was perceptive in ways that sometimes alarmed her, noticed immediately. By the end of the first week, he had decided that Kalle was acceptable. By the end of the second week, he was saving things to tell him. Little accumulations of information and observation held carefully through the day. She watched this happen and felt two things simultaneously, which was complicated. The first was pure, uncomplicated joy. Emmerich was being known by someone who was his. Someone who held the origin of him, the future of him, the full and unedited reality of who this child was going to become. Whatever else she thought about the situation, that was real. And it was good. And she was glad for it. The second was more complicated. Every day Kalle was here, Emmerich was incorporating him into the architecture of his world, adding him to the list of permanent things. And when the threat was resolved, and Kalle took Emmerich back to Duskfall, she stopped the thought, filed it. Not yet. The conversation she had been avoiding arrived on a Wednesday evening in the 5th week. Emmerich had had a difficult day. A fall in the market had left him with scraped palms and rattled composure, and the particular exhaustion of a child who had spent the afternoon managing pain with dignity had finally caught up with him at dinner. He had been quiet and tearful in a way he rarely was, and getting him settled had taken longer than usual. She came downstairs to find Kalle at the kitchen table. He was not doing anything, just sitting in the lamplight with his hands folded and his face doing the thing it did when he thought he was alone. Unguarded. The exhaustion and the weight of it visible in a way he did not usually permit. She poured tea and sat down. He has days like this, she said. The difficult ones. He's always fine by morning. I know, he said. He was quiet for a moment. I keep doing the arithmetic. What I missed. How many of these days there were that He stopped. I know it wasn't my choice. I know Farron did what he had to do. It doesn't help with the arithmetic. She looked at him across the table, at the careful, precise control of him, and the thing underneath it that was not controlled at all. You didn't choose to miss them, she said. No, he said. But I missed them. Yes. The lamp moved in a draft from the window. Outside, the spring night was warm and dark and full of the sound of things growing. What do you want to happen? She asked. When this is over, when the faction is dealt with and it's safe, what do you actually want? He looked at her. The look was long and steady and entirely without deflection. I want him to be who he is here, he said. I want him to keep this. What you've given him. The way he is. The curiosity and the gentleness and the... He stopped. I want to give him a future, and I don't want to do it at the cost of his present. He paused. I don't want to take him away from you. She kept her face still. But you'll take him back to Duskfall. He is the alpha heir. That is not something I can change. He held her gaze. But Duskfall is not small. There is work there for a healer. Real work. Work that matters. More than this town can give you. And there is a place there for someone he will not sleep without. I am not asking you to disappear from his life, because I have arrived in it. I am asking, if anything, the opposite. Her heart was doing something inelegant. You're asking me to come to Duskfall, she said. I am telling you, he said carefully, that whatever allows him to keep both of us is what I want. Whatever shape that takes. I am not asking for anything beyond that right now. She looked at him for a long time, at the care of him, at the way he had framed it around Emmerich rather than around himself, or the bond she was so increasingly certain he could feel as clearly as she could. I need time, she said. Of course, he said. She went to bed. In the dark she lay still, and thought about the difference between the life she had built, careful and small and entirely hers, and something larger and less certain that she had not planned for. She thought for a long time. She did not sleep quickly, but when she did, her dreams were not about loss. The 2 remaining faction members arrived on a Friday morning in the 6th week. When the market was full and Emmerich was riding on Kalle's hip, because he had decided he was tired and the most efficient solution was to become her solved problem. She felt the wrongness before she saw it. This was one of the things her half-wolf blood gave her. Not the full wolf sensorium. Not the range that Emmerich would eventually have, but something more than ordinary human perception. A quality of awareness. A sensitivity to the specific atmospheric shift that happened when wolf-born attention was focused and predatory. She turned. Two men at the far edge of the market square. Both wolf-born, both looking at Emmerich with the focused intensity of people who had found what they were looking for. Kala had been a healer for 16 years. She had managed emergencies with the calm that emergencies required. She adjusted Emmerich on her hip, turned his face gently into her shoulder, so he was looking away from the two men, and walked. Not quickly, not running, ordinarily, in the direction she had last seen Kale. She did not need to find him. He found her. He was beside her in moments, having come from the bread stall, and the second he reached her side she felt it. The bond, which had been a warm and quiet thing in her chest for 5 weeks, went suddenly, completely live. Like a current switched on. Like a wire pulled taut. Eyes forward, he said. His voice was the voice she had been hearing for 6 weeks. Even, controlled. And underneath it was something else. Something that had no warmth in it at all, and was directed entirely away from her. Walk to the baker's corner. Go through the back. How many? She said. 2. I've had eyes on them since the North Road this morning. I sent word to my people, they'll be here before nightfall. He glanced at Emmerich, who had gone very still against her shoulder, not afraid, assessing, taking it in with those extraordinary senses. Go inside. Stay there. Bar the door. And you, I'm going to end this, he said. Quiet and absolute and entirely certain. She looked at him, at the controlled stillness of him, the quality of readiness that was something older than the alpha and deeper than the man. The wolf, she thought, the thing underneath everything that knew exactly what it was and what it was for. He looked back at her, and for just a second, between the control and the readiness, there was something else. Something that was only for her. Something that said, I will come back. Emmerich lifted his head. He looked at his father, with the amber eyes clear and calm, and said nothing. Just looked. Kale said, very quietly, Go with Kala. Emmerich put his head back on her shoulder, and held on. She walked to the baker's corner. She went through the back door. She found Oswin the blacksmith already there. The market community communicated in its own efficient way, and she stood in the warm bread smell with her son in her arms and her hand flat on his back, and her heartbeat even and controlled, and she listened to the market go quiet in the way markets went quiet when something was happening. Emmerich was very still. She pressed her lips to the top of his head. He smelled like himself, like the rosemary from her garden, and something that was purely his own, and she thought, we are going to be fine. She did not think it to comfort herself. She thought it because she believed it, which surprised her and also, in the same moment, did not surprise her at all. Is he going to be okay? Emmerich asked against her shoulder. Yes, she said. He's strong, Emmerich said. The same matter-of-fact certainty he used for established facts. He is, she said. A small pause. You're strong too, he said. Her eyes stung. She pressed them closed and breathed. Thank you, sweetheart. I know because you carry me, he said. I'm heavy. She laughed despite herself, helpless and sudden. And Emmerich laughed too. His big, wholehearted laugh that startled Oswin at his work table and made even that imperturbable man smile. Kale came back 20 minutes later. He had a cut above his left eye and a split lip, and he was holding himself with the specific, controlled stillness of a person managing more pain than they were showing. He stood in the doorway and found her eyes immediately, before anything else, and held them for a second that was not about either of them, but about all of it. The 6 weeks, the bond, the thing that had been building in the kitchen and the garden and across the dinner table and all the careful spaces between two people who had been very deliberately, not rushing. It's done, he said. Both of them. My pack will be here by evening to handle the rest. She set Emmerich down. She crossed the room. She put her hands on either side of his face, the way she put her hands on patients' faces when she needed to look at something clearly, and she turned his head toward the light. "Sit," she said. Sit down." He sat. She cleaned the cut with clean water and the wound yarrow tincture from the kit she always carried, working with the efficiency of a healer and the focus of someone who was not going to let her hands shake. Emmerich came and stood at Cale's knee and watched with the serious attention of a child witnessing something important. "Does it hurt?" Emmerich asked. "Somewhat," Cale said. Emmerich nodded gravely. He reached out and patted Cale's hand, the same gesture he used with anyone who was hurting, that instinctive, uncalculated comfort. "Calla will fix it," he said. "She always does." Cale looked up at her. She was close. She had to be, for the stitching, and he looked at her with the unguarded expression she had been collecting like evidence, each one filed carefully, building toward something she had not yet let herself name. "He's right," Cale said, quietly. Only for her. She kept her eyes on the cut. She did not trust her face right now. "Hold still," she said. He held still. He was very good at it. The Duskfall wolves arrived at dusk. 6 of them, efficient and disciplined, handling the aftermath with the quiet professionalism of a pack whose alpha had trained them well. They looked at Emmerich with a reverence they kept carefully controlled, as if the heir's presence required a different quality of attention than anything else they had encountered. They looked at Calla with curiosity they were too well trained to voice. She felt it anyway. Cale sent them to camp at the edge of town. He came inside. Emmerich was in the garden with Petra, who had arrived at the house shortly after they had, with bread and the expression of a woman who had decided to be useful and ask questions later. Through the kitchen window, Calla could see Emmerich showing her something in the hedge, explaining it with the expansive gestures he used for things he found particularly interesting. Petra's face was doing the thing it always did, that helpless, involuntary softening. Cale stood in the doorway and watched them. "He's going to be extraordinary," he said. The words were quiet and contained and meant all of it. Not just the future, but this, what Emmerich already was. What 3 years of being loved the right way had made him. "I know," Calla said. He turned. She was at the counter with her hands around a cup of tea she hadn't drunk yet, her eyes on the garden. She had spent the night after he came back from the market being precise with herself, asking the questions she had been deferring and making herself sit with the answers. She was done deferring. "It's safe now," she said. "You can take him back to Duskfall." "Yes," he said. She nodded. He was watching her with the particular quality of attention she had come to understand was his version of reading the room. Complete, unhurried, missing nothing. "The offer stands," he said. "What I said before. There is real work for you in Duskfall. The pack's senior healer is retiring at year's end, and I have been looking for her replacement for 2 years. It is not a courtesy position. It is not something I am inventing to make the arrangement palatable." He paused. "And there is the other part. The part that has nothing to do with the work or the arrangement or what is practical." She looked at him. "You should know something," she said. He waited. "I feel it," she said. "The bond, I have felt it for 5 weeks. I know what it is and I am not—" She stopped, chose her words with care. "I am not saying what I am about to say because of it. The bond is a fact. It is not a reason. I have known bonded pairs whose bonds were facts and whose lives together were still either good or not good, depending on who they were, not on the bond. So," she took a breath, "I want to be clear that what I'm saying comes from me, not from the bond." His face was very still, listening completely. "I have watched you for 6 weeks, she said. "I have watched you with Emmerich, and with the town, and with the work, and with me. I have watched you earn something that you could have demanded and chose not to. That mattered to me. The patience of it. The way you asked permission for things you had every right, in your world, by your rules, to simply take." She looked at him steadily. "Whatever you were doing, it worked." Something moved in his throat. "I am terrified," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I have built something here that is entirely mine, and I know what I am giving up, and I know what I am walking into, and I am still—" She stopped. "I am still coming. If the offer is real, if the place in Duskfall is for me, and not for a version of me that is smaller and quieter, and more convenient. He crossed the kitchen, 3 steps, unhurried, and then he was in front of her, and he put his hands on either side of her face. Same gesture she had used on him the day before, returned now with different meaning, or perhaps the same meaning made explicit, and he said, "The offer is for you, exactly as you are, everything you are." She looked at him, at the honesty in his face, the complete and unguarded honesty of someone who had learned, at some point in 11 years of being alpha, that certain things required the whole truth or nothing. "If I come," she said, "I come as myself, not as the heir's guardian, not as the pack healer, as myself." "Yes," he said, simply, completely. "And we do this, whatever this is, at a pace that I can manage. I am not a woman who moves quickly into things." "I know," he said. "I've noticed." Something in her chest that had been locked for a very long time made a sound like a key turning. "All right," she said. He exhaled. It was not dramatic, just a breath, released. The sound of a man setting down something he had been carrying for a significant amount of time. Outside, Emmeric's voice rose in the garden, loud and delighted, narrating something to Petra with great enthusiasm. They both looked toward the sound at the same moment, and Calla saw it on Cale's face, the whole of it, the full impossible sum of this ordinary, extraordinary morning. His son in a garden, the woman who had raised him, standing close enough to touch. "All right," she said again, softer, meaning it all the way down. Emmerich named all the horses. He did this on the first morning of the journey, moving down the line of Duskfall Wolves' horses with the systematic focus of someone with a job to do, studying each animal with the same complete attention he gave everything, and then announcing names that he had apparently decided on internally and was now making official. Bracken, River, Stone, Mist, Alderman, for the oldest one, because he looks like he has opinions, and Thornwood, for the large bay that the most senior Duskfall wolf had ridden for 6 years and had clearly not anticipated needing to rename. "What about Cale's horse?" Calla asked. Emmerich regarded Cale's horse with the gravity of a person making an important decision. The horse regarded him back. "Bramble," Emmerich said. Cale, beside her, made a small sound. "That's a very good name," Calla said pleasantly. Cale looked at her. She kept her expression entirely neutral. "Bramble," he said, to the horse, which had the dignified and resigned air of an animal that had survived worse. Emmerich nodded, satisfied, and moved on to inspect the cart horse. The senior Duskfall wolf appeared at Cale's shoulder. His expression was the specific expression of a man in service to a powerful alpha who was watching that alpha be outmaneuvered by a 3-year-old and finding it necessary to maintain absolute neutrality. "Alpha," he said. "We're ready when you are." "We're ready," Cale said. The wolf looked at Calla. She had learned, in the past day, that his name was Davin and that he had been with Cale for 7 years and that he communicated primarily through implication. What he was implying now, with the look he gave her, was something like, "Good." Finally, she looked away before she smiled. Petra had cried. She had done it efficiently, in the way she did everything. 4 minutes of standing at the gate with her arms around Calla, while Emmerich watched with the respectful solemnity of a child who understood that goodbyes were significant, and then she had straightened up and handed over 2 jars of preserved plums and a length of good wool and said, "Write. Properly. Not just to say you're alive." "I'll write properly," Calla said. "The boy too. When he can. The boy too." Petra looked at Cale with the assessing look she had given him on first meeting. Measured and direct. Whatever she was looking for, she found enough of it. "Take care of them," she said. "Not a request." "Yes," he said. Petra went inside. Calla stood at her gate, the gate she had opened 6 years ago and 3 years ago and every morning in between, and looked at her house for a moment. Her herbs, left for whoever came next. The garden she had planted and tended. The room upstairs where she had lain awake so many nights thinking about the small sleeping person down the hall, and the enormous decision she had made on a winter night. She thought, "I would do it again. Every single part of it. Then she picked up her bag, which contained her healer's kit and her journals, and the blue cup and the quilt from her bed, and the small carved figure Petra had pressed into her hands that morning, and she walked to the cart and did not look back. The second afternoon of travel, she sat in the cart with her journal in her lap and Emmerich asleep against her side, knocked out by motion and excitement, and 3 consecutive early mornings. He was deeply, completely asleep, his mouth slightly open, his fist tucked under his chin. He looked younger in sleep. The gravity he carried in his waking hours went somewhere else, and he became simply what he was, a small child, perfectly and entirely himself. She watched Cale ride ahead. He was talking to Davin, something quiet that she couldn't hear at this distance. Cale's shoulder did the thing it did when something amused him. Not quite a laugh, a small movement, a release. One of the other wolves looked over at the cart, looked at Cale, said something to the wolf beside him. Both of them had the expressions of people who had been waiting for something for a long time and were watching it finally resolve. She looked down at Emmerich. She thought about the note, the 4 lines, the deteriorating handwriting, the last, desperate pleas. He is not yet what he will become. Neither are you. She had read it as instruction the first time. She understood it now as something else. A gift. Maybe. An observation from a dying man who had seen, in the 10 seconds she had stood in her doorway, exactly what she was, and exactly what the child would need, and who had trusted her with both. She was not the woman who had opened that door. She was not the woman who had carried Emmerich's weight carefully at arm's length, afraid to claim too much, afraid of the particular grief of loving something she might not get to keep. She was going to Duskfall. She was going with her son and toward a man who had spent 6 weeks earning something instead of demanding it. And the road ahead was full of things she didn't know yet, which was frightening, and also, underneath the fear, something that felt almost like relief. She had not known, until recently, how tired she was of the small life. How much of her had been waiting for the door to open onto something larger. Cale dropped back from divan and brought his horse alongside the cart. He looked at Emmerich. That specific look, the one she had been watching for 6 weeks, that held 3 years of missing and a lifetime of future, and then at her. He's been asleep for an hour, she said. Good. He looked at the road ahead. The forest starts at the ridge. It'll be cooler once we're in it. He'll wake up for that, she said. He's been asking about the Duskfall forest since you described it. What did he ask? Whether the trees were the kind you could climb, whether there were beetles, whether wolves actually ran through forests, or whether that was something people said. She paused. I did not have definitive answers on the beetles. Davin has opinions about this. Emmerich will be very pleased. A silence. The cart wheels on the road. The sound of the horses, the wind coming down off the ridge, the first real warmth of the afternoon settling over the valley. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. That first night, when you saw him in the garden. Before he spoke, she watched his face. What did you think? He was quiet for a moment. His eyes were on the ridge, but they were somewhere else. I thought, he said slowly, that I had spent 3 years imagining what it would feel like to find him. I had prepared for every version of it that I could think of. The relief, the anger, the grief for what had been lost. He paused. I had not prepared for the version where he was. That. Where the first thing he said was that I smelled like the forest. Another pause. Where you were standing between him and the gate with your shears in your hand and your chin up, and I understood in about 3 seconds that the person who had done this was not someone I was going to be able to manage or navigate around. That she was someone I was going to have to reckon with. She looked at him. And I was glad, he said. Simply. I was glad he had someone like that. He glanced at her. The unguarded look. The one she had been collecting. I was not prepared for what came after that. But I was glad for it. The ridge was closer now. The trees at the top were dark against the afternoon sky. Old growth, enormous, the kind that had been standing for centuries, and would stand for centuries more. Resettled, pulled her arm tighter around him with the instinct of a child who knew exactly where warmth came from. She held him closer. She looked at the forest at the top of the ridge, and thought of everything that was on the other side of it. The pack, the work. The life she had agreed to build in a place she had never seen, with a man she had known for 6 weeks, in a world that was larger than the one she had been living in. She thought of Petra at the gate, her arms around Kala. 4 minutes of grief handled efficiently. She thought of a winter night, a lantern, a door she had almost not opened. She thought, I am not the woman who almost didn't open the door. Kale, she said. He looked at her. When we get there, she said, I want to see the forest. Not the pack grounds, not the hall, the forest first. The 3 of us. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face went soft in the way it went soft when he was feeling something he had decided not to manage. Yes, he said. The forest first. Emmerich woke as they crested the ridge. He came awake the way he did everything, completely, immediately, without transition. He sat up and looked at the forest spreading below them in the late afternoon light, enormous and dark and full of that particular quality of illumination that came through old canopy, green gold and shifting. He was very still for a moment. Are there beetles? He asked. An unreasonable number, Kale said. Emmerich turned to look at him. His amber eyes were bright and fully awake, and full of the specific delight of a person receiving information they have been waiting for. Unreasonable, he said, tasting the word. Davin has opinions, Kale said. Emmerich looked at Davin, who had developed, over 2 days, a patient and increasingly warm relationship with the heir's many inquiries. Tomorrow, Emmerich told him, I am going to show you which ones are ground beetles and which ones are rove beetles. You can tell by the thorax. Davin managed his expression heroically. I look forward to it, he said. Emmerich turned back to the forest. He put both hands on the side of the cart and leaned forward slightly, looking down into the dark and the green and the gold. Kala, he said. Yes, I think I'm going to like it here. She looked at the forest. She looked at the man riding beside the cart. She looked at the child leaning into the view with his whole body, trusting the cart's edge, trusting her arm around him, trusting the world to be as interesting as he had always believed it to be. Yes, she said. I think so too. They rode down into duskfall as the sun touched the tops of the old trees. The forest rose around them like a cathedral. Old wood, old light, the specific deep quiet of a place that had been standing long before any of them and would be standing long after. Emmerich was awake and turning in every direction, cataloging, already asking questions that Kale answered with the patient thoroughness that Kala had watched him develop over 6 weeks and that she suspected had always been there, underneath the alpha, waiting for the right person to ask. She thought of the note one last time. I am sorry to do this to a stranger. She was not sorry. She would not be, she thought, for the rest of her life, for the door she had opened and the child she had picked up and the name she had given him and the years she had spent learning who he was, for the gate she had made a stranger wait at, and the kitchen table where she had listened to everything, and the 6 weeks of careful accumulation that had led to this road, this forest, this man riding beside her and this child in her arms. The stranger who had arrived on her threshold had given her something she had not known she was missing. She pulled Emmerich a little closer. He leaned into her without looking, automatic and complete. The gesture of a child who had never once doubted he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The trees closed around them. Duskfall opened ahead. She rode on.